Charlotte Lindström, the shocking truth behind the drug lord's crime documentary S01 E10. Hook. What if everything you knew about your past was a lie? Charlotte's world is turned upside down as she's hunted by dangerous forces, all while uncovering a shocking truth about her father and herself. But the worst part, it's only the beginning. Stay tuned to find out the shocking twists that will leave you questioning everything. Charlotte Lindström stood motionless in the dark alley. A cold wind bit through her thin jacket. Her breath came in shallow gasps, fogging in the night air. She'd made her way through the winding streets, dodging shadows, always watching. The city had a pulse, a rhythm she knew too well, but tonight it felt different. The silence was unnerving. Her eyes darted across the street, scanning for movement. Every sound was amplified. The distant hum of a car, the tapping of a distant dog's paws. She wasn't alone. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't turn around. She couldn't let them know she was aware. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She felt the heat of breath on her neck, then the cold, metallic touch of a barrel pressed against her back. Her spine stiffened. "Don't scream," a voice growled. Her muscles tensed. She didn't dare make a sound. Charlotte was no stranger to danger, but tonight felt different. Tonight it was real. She had a choice: run or face whatever came next. She couldn't decide. Move. The voice cut through the thick air like a knife. Her feet started moving before she could think. Her pulse raced. The alley stretched out in front of her, longer, darker, endless. She couldn't see their faces, but she knew they were there, waiting, watching. Every instinct screamed to run, but she had no idea where the path would lead. A shadow ahead shifted, and Charlotte stopped dead in her tracks. A figure stepped into the dim light. It was him, the one man she had been trying to avoid for years. Victor Marquez, the notorious drug lord. Her stomach turned. The air around her seemed to thicken. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This was no accident. She was in his territory now, and there was no escaping it. The man behind her pressed harder on the barrel, forcing her forward. "Keep walking," Marquez's cold voice rang out. Charlotte's mind raced. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. Each step was a struggle. She knew the stakes. She could never go back. Her world had just narrowed to one moment, one decision. She took another step, and then everything went black. Her head spun as the world around her dissolved into darkness. The last thing she remembered was the cold metal pressing against her skin. Then nothing. When Charlotte regained consciousness, she was lying on something hard. A cold, damp surface. Her arms were bound, wrists raw from the tight ropes. The room was eerily quiet. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. She tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through her leg. She froze. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The last image before she passed out was Marquez's face. He was cold, unfeeling, just like the walls around her now. She slowly opened her eyes. The dim light barely illuminated the concrete walls. The air smelled of mold and something darker, like fear. Footsteps echoed outside the door. Slow, methodical. Charlotte tensed. She knew it wasn't good. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The door creaked open. A tall figure filled the frame. Victor Marquez. His face was unreadable. He stepped into the room, locking the door behind him. Charlotte's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Marquez took a step closer. His eyes scanned her, cold and calculating. "You've made a lot of enemies, Charlotte," he said, his voice low. She swallowed hard, the words heavy in her chest. She was no longer in control. She was at his mercy. The room seemed to shrink as the seconds ticked by. Every movement felt deliberate, every breath a struggle. He knelt in front of her. "Why did you run?" he asked. Charlotte's mind screamed at her to lie, to come up with a story. But the truth was a prison she couldn't escape. "I didn't run," she finally whispered. Marquez smiled darkly. "Then you have no idea how deep you're in." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Charlotte's body stiffened. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to end it. The silence in the room was deafening. Charlotte strained against the ropes, trying to free herself, but it was no use. Her wrists burned from the pressure, the rope biting into her skin. She took slow, shallow breaths, trying to steady her racing heart. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Her mind was a blur of panic. What did Marquez want from her? What was he planning? The thought of her loved ones being caught in his web sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't let that happen. She had to find a way out. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for anything she could use. A piece of broken glass, a sharp edge, anything to cut through the ropes. But the room was empty. She was trapped, and time was running out. The door creaked open again, causing her to tense. Marquez's silhouette filled the doorway. This time he wasn't alone. A man stepped in behind him, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in shadow. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. He was holding something, a small, silver syringe. Charlotte's stomach twisted with dread. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. Marquez didn't even acknowledge her fear. "Time to make your choice, Charlotte," he said, his voice cold and indifferent. The man with the syringe moved closer, his hand steady as he held the needle up in the dim light. "You don't have to do this," Charlotte pleaded, her voice trembling with desperation. Marquez just watched her, unmoved. "Do you want to know what happens next?" he asked. "Because you're going to make me wait much longer, and that's not something I'm willing to do." Charlotte's mind raced. Her eyes darted around the room again. No way out. Nothing to defend herself with. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. The syringe glinted in the low light, and the man took another step toward her. There was no way she could fight him. Her body was weak, her strength drained from fear and the tight bonds around her wrists. She had one shot, one moment. "Please," Charlotte's voice broke. "I don't know what you want from me." Marquez's eyes were cold, unforgiving. "You're going to tell me everything, Charlotte," he said. "Everything you've been hiding." The man with the syringe reached her side, his hand coming down toward her arm. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the cold metal of the needle just inches away. This was it. This was her choice. And she had no idea if she was going to survive whatever came next. The needle hovered inches from her skin, gleaming in the dim light. Charlotte's breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. All she could hear was the sound of her heart thundering in her ears, drowning out everything else. The man's hand trembled slightly as he held the syringe, as if he were unsure, hesitant. For the briefest of moments, Charlotte saw an opening. She could feel the rope starting to loosen slightly, a tiny shift, barely noticeable. It was enough. Her body acted on instinct. In one swift, desperate motion, she jerked her arm to the side, causing the syringe to miss her by mere inches. The man cursed, stumbling backward in surprise. Charlotte's breath came in jagged gasps as she pulled her arm free, her wrists raw and bleeding from the ropes. Adrenaline surged through her veins, giving her the strength she thought she had lost. She could see Marquez's eyes flare with anger, his cold mask cracking for a split second. "Get her," he snarled. The man lunged at her, but Charlotte was already moving. Her legs felt like lead, but she pushed through the pain, scrambling to her feet. She had no plan, no direction, but she couldn't stay here. Not with him. Not with Marquez. Her eyes scanned the room, the door, her only hope. She made a run for it, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Her legs threatened to give out under her, but she couldn't stop. She reached the door, her fingers fumbling for the handle. The man was right behind her. She could hear his heavy footsteps, feel his presence closing in. Charlotte yanked the door open, slamming it into the man's chest as he tried to grab her. He staggered back, but it wasn't enough. She was already out of the room. The hallway stretched before her, dark and narrow, with no clear escape. But she kept running from the nightmare she couldn't escape. Her mind raced, her options narrowing, her vision blurring with exhaustion. She heard Marquez's voice echoing down the hall. She won't get far. The sound sent a chill through her. She didn't care. She wasn't going to stop. Not yet. She couldn't. Her feet pounded against the cold, hard floor, echoing through the narrow hallway. Each step felt like it could be her last. She didn't dare look back. Her focus was sharp, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. She needed to find a way out. The hallway twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the heart of the building. It felt like a maze. She could hear the sounds of pursuit behind her, steady and relentless. The man was close, too close. Charlotte's breath came in ragged bursts, but she pushed herself harder. There had to be a way out. She rounded a corner sharply, almost stumbling, and spotted a door at the far end of the corridor. A chance. Her pulse quickened. She surged forward, ignoring the ache in her legs, the dizziness creeping at the edges of her vision. Her hand grabbed the handle just as she heard the sound of footsteps closing in. She yanked the door open and slammed it behind her. The sudden shift in environment hit her like a punch. She was outside. The cool night air rushed into her lungs, fresh and sharp. The building was towering behind her, dark and oppressive. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. She bolted forward into the street, eyes darting for any sign of help, any car, any passerby. But the street was empty, silent. Her heart raced faster, fear clawing at her throat. She had no idea where she was, no idea what direction to go. Her only instinct was to keep moving. Charlotte darted down an alley, her footsteps muffled against the damp pavement. She could hear her pursuers' footsteps, growing fainter, but still there. They weren't far behind. Her mind was spinning. What would she do next? She needed to disappear. She needed to vanish. She couldn't let them catch her. A flicker of movement caught her eye in the distance. A car. It was parked on the side of the street, its headlights dim, but still on. Her heart leaped. Maybe it was someone who could help. Maybe not. But she had to take the chance. She ran toward it, her breath coming in ragged bursts, praying for a miracle. As she approached the car, she saw a figure sitting inside, hunched over. Her hand reached for the door handle, but then the door opened suddenly, and a figure stepped out. Marquez. A smirk spread across his face as he stepped closer. "Did you really think you could escape, Charlotte?" he said, his voice cold and mocking. Charlotte froze. Her body went numb. She had run right into his trap. And now there was nowhere to go to. Charlotte's heart slammed against her ribs as she faced Marquez. She had no escape, no plan. Her mind was blank, panic flooding every corner of her body. His cold gaze locked onto hers, unreadable, calculating. "You're good at running," he said, stepping toward her. "But I always find you, Charlotte. Always." She stumbled back, her legs shaking beneath her, but she didn't dare turn around. Not again. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll do whatever you want. Just let me go." Marquez stopped in his tracks, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "That's the thing, Charlotte. You don't get to make that choice anymore." The words hit her like a punch, a cold, hard truth. The distance between them felt like miles now, but his presence was suffocating. The cold metal of a gun gleamed in his hand, the barrel pointed straight at her chest. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak, like they were turning to stone beneath her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The gun was too close, too real. "Please," she gasped, every ounce of fear pouring into those two words. Marquez tilted his head, almost in amusement. He lowered the gun slightly, just enough for Charlotte to see the coldness in his eyes. "You're still thinking like you have a choice," he said, his voice eerily calm. "But you don't." Charlotte's mind raced, thoughts scrambling for a way out, but there was nothing. She was trapped. "Why?" she whispered almost to herself. "Why me?" His gaze sharpened, the flicker of a memory crossing his face. "You were never supposed to be in my way, Charlotte," he said. "But you made the mistake of thinking you could change things." She was shaking now, her whole body trembling from fear, from the cold, from the weight of the moment. The gun was back at her chest. She felt the pressure, like a slow, suffocating vice. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, feel the seconds stretch out painfully. Marquez didn't move. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, a sharp sound sliced through the stillness. A gunshot. But it wasn't Marquez's. The blast came from behind him. Marquez's eyes widened in shock. He turned just as a figure appeared from the shadows, stepping into the light. It was a man Charlotte had never seen before, his face hardened, eyes cold. But his hand was steady as he aimed the gun at Marquez. Marquez staggered back, his expression turning from surprise to fury. But before he could speak, the man fired again. Marquez fell to the ground, the cold concrete meeting his body with a sickening thud. Charlotte froze, her eyes wide, her body still. The man stood over Marquez's body, his face impassive. He turned slowly to Charlotte. "You're not safe yet," he said, his voice low and tense. Her heart raced as she tried to process the situation. "Who are you?" she gasped, fear mixing with confusion. The man didn't answer at first. He just motioned for her to follow. "Come with me," he said. "We don't have time." The fear was still gripping her, but something in his voice pushed her forward. She had no choice but to follow him. As they disappeared into the shadows, the world she knew felt like it was slipping further away, each step taking her deeper into the unknown. Charlotte's heart was still pounding in her chest as she followed the man into the darkness. Her mind was a swirl of confusion, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Who was he? Why had he saved her? She had no answers, but there was no time for questions. The man moved with purpose, his steps swift and sure, never looking back to check if she was following. She kept her distance, her body still trembling, her mind trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The street was eerily quiet now, the distant sound of traffic the only sign of life. They moved through alleyways, the shadows swallowing them whole with each turn. Finally, the man stopped at an old, rundown building. He glanced around, making sure no one was watching, before quickly pulling open the door and ushering her inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mold and rust. The space felt like an abandoned warehouse, with broken windows and peeling paint. The man shut the door behind them with a heavy, echoing thud. Charlotte looked around, her eyes wide, trying to take in her new surroundings. She wanted to say something, ask a million questions, but the words caught in her throat. He had saved her, but at what cost? The man turned to her, his eyes sharp, unreadable. "Sit," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and sat on a nearby crate, the cold metal pressing through her clothes. She couldn't stop shaking. She still couldn't wrap her head around what had just happened. Marquez, the syringe, the gunshot. Her mind was a tangle of fear and confusion. The man took a step closer, his face finally coming into full view. He was older than she expected, late 30s, maybe early 40s. His jaw was set, his dark eyes intense, but there was something behind them, something she couldn't quite place. "You're lucky," he said quietly, his voice now softer, but no less serious. Charlotte opened her mouth, but the words she needed to speak didn't come. She was still trying to catch her breath, still trying to process the fact that she had been moments away from death. The man's gaze softened, just for a moment, before he spoke again. "Marquez had plans for you, but you weren't supposed to make it this far." Charlotte shuddered, the memory of Marquez's cold words still fresh in her mind. She wasn't supposed to make it this far. She had barely escaped with her life. What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his tone darkening. "Marquez is only one part of the equation." Her heart dropped. "What do you mean?" she whispered. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned away, pacing for a moment before returning his gaze to her. "You're caught in something bigger, Charlotte," he said, his voice low. "Something much bigger than you realize." Her mind raced. "Bigger than Marquez? What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice cracking with a mixture of fear and frustration. The man's eyes met hers, his expression serious. "They've been watching you, waiting for the right moment to move." Her breath caught in her throat. Who's been watching me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, walking to the far corner of the room, where a desk sat cluttered with papers, old files, and a laptop. Charlotte stayed where she was, her eyes fixed on him. She could feel the tension building again, thick and suffocating, like they were both waiting for something. "Your past," the man finally said, turning to face her again. "It's caught up with you, and now it's too late to run." Charlotte's breath hitched, and the weight of his words crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her past, she didn't understand. What did he mean? She tried to steady herself, but the panic was rising again, clawing at her chest. "What do you mean, too late to run?" she asked, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond right away. He moved toward the desk, pulling open one of the drawers and rifling through it. Charlotte could hear the scrape of paper, the rustle of files. He pulled out a thick envelope, yellowed with age, and tossed it onto the table in front of her. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the familiar handwriting across the front. Lindström, her name. She stared at it for a long moment, her hands trembling. "Open it," the man said, his voice almost a command. Her fingers shook as she reached for the envelope, the reality of what was happening hitting her harder with each passing second. She pulled the papers from inside, her hands moving almost mechanically as she unfolded them. The documents inside were old, too old. The ink had faded, but the words were clear enough, and as she scanned through them, she felt the ground beneath her feet start to slip away. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Her name was everywhere, but it wasn't just her name. It was her father's name, too. Her entire family was listed on these papers. And then, in bold black letters at the bottom, the one thing that made her blood run cold. Subject: Operation Reaper. Charlotte's pulse quickened as she reread the words, her stomach turning over. What the hell was this? "What is this?" she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked up at the man. His gaze didn't falter. "Your father wasn't just some low-level criminal," he said. "He was part of something much bigger, a network that Marquez was only a small part of." Charlotte felt like the room was spinning. Her father? Her mind raced back to the days of her childhood, to the pieces of her life she had never fully understood. Her father had been gone for years. She thought he was dead. But now, with the documents in her hands, it felt like everything she knew was a lie. Operation Reaper was a covert operation, the man continued, his voice lowering as he stepped closer to her. It was supposed to be a way to infiltrate the highest levels of criminal networks without anyone knowing. But it got out of control. She couldn't breathe. Her head swam. Marquez wasn't just a drug lord. He was part of something much larger, a chain of influence that stretched farther than she could even imagine. And somehow, her father had been part of it. "Your father was a key player," the man said, his voice now a low murmur. "But when things went sideways, they erased him. The problem is they never erased you." Charlotte's stomach twisted. "They're still watching," the man continued, his eyes narrowing. "And now they want you. You're the missing piece of the puzzle." Charlotte's world was crumbling. Her father's past, hidden from her for so long, was now dragging her into a darkness she had never known. "But why me?" she gasped. "I don't even know what this is. I was just trying to survive. The man cut her off, his gaze sharp. "Surviving isn't enough anymore. Not for you. Not with what you know now." Her heart pounded in her chest. "Who is they?" she whispered, desperate to understand. The man hesitated. He knew something that could finally give her the answers she had been searching for. But instead, he took a step back. "Who they are isn't as important as what they can do," he said quietly. "And what they will do to you if you don't make a decision, Charlotte." She shook her head, the weight of it all overwhelming her. "What decision?" she whispered. His eyes darkened. "You can stay hidden, keep running, or you can fight back. But make no mistake, the second you step into the light, they'll come for you. And there's no going back." She was frozen, the enormity of the choice paralyzing her. There was no turning back. There was no safe place. And whatever came next, she wasn't ready. But there was no choice. They would never leave her alone. And neither would her past. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Charlotte's mind was spinning, trying to piece together everything that had just been dumped on her. Her father, her family, part of a secret, dangerous network. And now it was her turn. She could feel her heart pounding, an unrelenting drumbeat against her ribs. "Fight back," she whispered to herself, more to steady her nerves than anything else. But it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a death sentence. The man watched her carefully, as if he could read every thought racing through her mind. His gaze never wavered. He wasn't offering her hope, just the stark reality of her situation. "Time is running out," he said quietly, as though the clock had already started ticking. "You think they'll give you time to figure this out? They won't." Charlotte could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, the pressure mounting. "How do you know all of this?" she asked, her voice small, despite the weight of the question. The man hesitated. "You don't want to know," he replied, his tone dark, his expression unreadable. Charlotte's stomach turned. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, the air heavier. Every part of her screamed for escape, but there was nowhere to run. The truth of it all was too much, and yet there was no choice left. Her options were slim: fight back, or be hunted for the rest of her life. She had spent so long just surviving, never once questioning why. Now, she was being forced into something darker. She looked down at the papers still in her hands, the truth written in black and white. The same truth that had brought her to this moment. Her father's involvement. The deep, shadowy network of power. Marquez was just a small piece, but he was dangerous. And now they were after her too. She didn't know what to do next, how to stop it all. But one thing was clear. The man in front of her had seen this before. He knew the rules of this world, the world she was now entangled in. "You've been in this game a long time, haven't you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The man's lips twitched slightly, but his eyes remained cold. "You could say that." Charlotte swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice shaking despite herself. The man didn't answer immediately. He took a step closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "Next," he said finally, "we find out who else is hunting you. And we make sure you're ready." Her stomach flipped. He wasn't offering safety. He wasn't offering an easy way out. What he was offering was more of this, more darkness, more danger. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't want this. She didn't want any of it, but it was already too late. Her past was dragging her into this, whether she was ready or not. The man stepped back, his face unreadable. "Get some rest," he said. "You'll need it. We move tomorrow." "Where are we going?" she asked, almost too afraid to hear the answer. He didn't answer right away, his gaze shifting to the dark corner of the room. "We're going to war," he finally said, his voice low. "And this time, there's no turning back." The words echoed in her mind as she slowly sank into a chair, her hands still gripping the papers, her thoughts a whirlwind. War. It felt like the only word that could describe what she was facing. And deep down, Charlotte knew there was no escaping it now. She was part of this world. Whether she wanted to be or not, Charlotte sat in a cold, dimly lit room, the weight of the man's words pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. War. She closed her eyes, but it didn't help. The images of everything that had happened, the gun, the papers, Marquez's cold gaze, flashed through her mind like a relentless slideshow. She was in too deep now. There was no escaping. The man had said they would move tomorrow, but Charlotte had no idea what that meant. What kind of war was he talking about? She glanced around the room again, the shadows casting long, haunting shapes across the walls. Everything felt off, alien, like she was no longer in control of her own life. And in that moment, she hated it. She hated the fear, the uncertainty, the helplessness. But deep down, she knew she had to keep moving. She couldn't let them win. Charlotte stood up, her legs shaky, but the need for action pushing her forward. There had to be something she could do, some way to get ahead of this. Her mind flicked to the man. He had saved her, yes, but that didn't mean he was on her side. She had no idea who he really was, what he wanted, and now she was in his hands with no real way out. Suddenly a low, creaking sound broke the silence, and she froze. The door to the room opened slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Charlotte's pulse spiked as she tensed, instinctively moving closer to the corner of the room. She couldn't risk being caught off guard again. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. It wasn't the man who had been speaking to her. This one was taller, broad-shouldered, with a posture that spoke of authority. But his face, it was hidden, cloaked in the darkness. Charlotte's mind raced. Who was this? Was it another part of the operation? Another enemy? She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly as she waited for him to speak. Finally, after a few agonizing seconds, the figure spoke. "She's awake," he said in a low, gravelly voice. The man who had been with her earlier shifted in place, standing more rigid now. "Get her ready," he ordered, his voice sharper than before. Charlotte's stomach dropped. What did they mean, get her ready? For what? She felt her heart thudding against her ribs as the man who had spoken earlier turned toward her, his expression now more serious than she had seen. "You have no choice in this, Charlotte," he said, his voice now colder. "You're in this world now. You'll either fight or you'll die." Her chest tightened. The air felt heavier. Everything inside her screamed to fight back, to run, to escape. But the reality was much harsher. She was trapped. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, betraying the fear she still felt. The man's expression softened ever so slightly, but it was a fleeting moment. "You'll see soon enough," he replied. Charlotte wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she kept her mouth shut. She had no power here. She knew that now. Without another word, the man motioned toward the door, and Charlotte was forced to follow him. As they stepped into the hallway, the cold air wrapped around her like a cloak. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the narrow corridor, each step a reminder of the uncertainty she faced. Her mind raced as they walked, the urgency in the man's pace increasing with every step. Where were they taking her? What was happening next? She didn't have time to find out, because within moments, they reached a set of stairs leading down to a lower floor, and as they descended, the walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing colder, more oppressive. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a large room, dimly lit by flickering lights. There, in the center of the room, was a table, and on the table, an assortment of weapons, tools, and equipment. Her stomach turned as she realized what was about to happen. She was being prepared for something she wasn't ready for. The man gave her a hard look, his face unreadable. "You don't have to like it," he said, "but this is how it's going to be from now on. You'll either be prepared, or you'll be dead." Charlotte's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had to keep her wits about her. She couldn't let them break her. Not yet. But as she looked around the room, the cold reality of the situation settled in. There was no going back now. That Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest as she stood at the edge of the room, eyes scanning the cold, sterile environment. The table in the center was piled high, with an unsettling collection of tools and weapons, their sharp edges gleaming in the dim light. The man, who had remained silent, stepped forward and grabbed a black duffel bag from the corner. He tossed it toward her, the heavy thud of it hitting the ground, sending a jolt through her body. "Pack your things," he ordered, his tone flat and unwavering. Charlotte froze for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, but she didn't have the luxury of choice. She had no time to hesitate. The man didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and began preparing a set of guns, loading them with practiced ease. Charlotte bent down slowly and unzipped the bag. Inside were clothes, dark, tactical gear, boots, and a few more pieces of equipment she didn't understand. A few masks, a set of night vision goggles. Her pulse spiked as she realized the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't a simple escape anymore. She was being prepared for something far worse. As she began packing the gear into the duffel bag, the man continued his work without looking up. "You're not just a target now," he said, his voice low, but steady. "You're a weapon. You have no idea how deep this goes. But you will." The words hit her like a punch. Charlotte's hands trembled as she folded the clothes and stuffed them into the bag. She was a weapon. Her mind reeled, but she didn't have the luxury to process it all. A part of her, buried deep inside, screamed for the life she once knew. A life without weapons, without danger, without the feeling of being hunted. But that life was gone, and now all she had left was survival. "Is there anyone else?" she asked suddenly, her voice a little rough from the weight of the realization. The man glanced at her briefly, his eyes cold and calculating. "Yes," he replied. "There are others, but you're not ready for them." Charlotte's stomach churned. Other people? Who were they? Were they like her? Or worse? But before she could ask more, the man stepped toward her, his hand outstretched for the bag. "Let's go," he said curtly. "We leave now." Charlotte hesitated for a moment, her instinct screaming at her to ask more questions. But she knew better than to waste time. She handed him the bag, her grip tight as she tried to steady her racing heart. As he took the bag, the cold reality of the situation settled even deeper into her bones. Her life, as she knew it, was over. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting for survival in a war she hadn't chosen. The man turned sharply and, without another word, led her toward the door. Charlotte followed, her thoughts clouded with fear and uncertainty. They stepped into the hallway, the oppressive silence hanging over them like a thick fog. With every step, the sense of impending danger grew heavier. Charlotte could almost feel it. Asterisk them asterisk, the ones who were hunting her, getting closer. The man moved swiftly, his pace never slowing, as if he were already anticipating every move, every threat. They turned another corner, and Charlotte's eyes scanned their surroundings. Everything about this place was designed to keep people in. Keep them contained. "Where are we going?" Charlotte asked quietly, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The man didn't look back, but his voice was clipped when he replied, "Out. Far from here. We can't stay in one place for long." "Why?" she pressed. "What happens if we do?" His lips curled into a grim smile, but there was no humor in it. "They'll find us," he said simply, "and they'll never stop." Charlotte's heart sank. Her worst fears had come true. She wasn't just in danger from Marquez or the operation. There were others, more powerful, more dangerous. And now she was at the mercy of them all. As they reached a set of heavy doors, the man paused. He glanced back at her, his eyes piercing. "Remember," he said, his voice low and serious, "this isn't a game. You're either with us or against us. And trust me, you don't want to be against us." Before she could respond, he yanked the door open, and the cold night air hit her like a slap in the face. Charlotte stepped outside, squinting against the darkness. The sky above was clear, the faint glow of distant city lights casting eerie shadows across the empty street. "Let's move," the man said, his voice urgent. Without another word, they started walking. Charlotte kept her eyes on the ground, each step feeling heavier than the last. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know what would happen next. But she did know one thing. She was in this now, and there was no going back. Charlotte's feet felt like lead as she followed the man down the deserted street. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. The man didn't speak again, his pace steady and unrelenting. Charlotte kept her eyes on the ground, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. Every step she took felt like a step further away from the life she knew, a life she couldn't even remember clearly anymore. They rounded a corner and came to a rusted, old car parked under a flickering streetlight. The man opened the door and gestured for her to get in. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, the reality of what was happening sinking in. This was it. She was no longer running. She was part of something bigger than herself now, something she couldn't control. She slid into the car, the worn leather seat creaking under her weight. The man got in after her, starting the engine with a low rumble. The headlights sliced through the dark, illuminating the road ahead as they sped off, leaving the small, grimy city behind. Charlotte didn't know where they were going, and frankly, she didn't care. She was still trying to digest everything the man had said. Her father, the operation, the weapons. It was all too much to process in such a short time. But there was something deeper gnawing at her, something she couldn't shake. She glanced at the man, who was driving with laser focus, his hands gripping the wheel with a quiet intensity. "Why me?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. The question had been swirling in her head for what felt like hours, and finally, she couldn't keep it inside anymore. The man didn't respond immediately. The seconds stretched, stretching the silence between them thin. He glanced at her briefly before looking back at the road, his expression unreadable. "Because you're the key," he said flatly. Charlotte blinked, her confusion growing deeper. "The key to what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His jaw tightened, but he didn't offer more. It was clear he wasn't going to explain. Charlotte sat back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm in her mind. But the questions didn't stop. Who was after her? Who else was involved in this operation? What did they want? And what was the Keeb she had become? Suddenly, the car jerked to the side, and Charlotte's eyes shot open. The man had swerved, narrowly avoiding an oncoming truck. She gasped, clutching the seat as her heart leapt into her throat. The man didn't even flinch, his grip on the wheel tightening as he maneuvered the car back into the center of the road with practiced precision. "We're not alone," he muttered, more to himself than to Charlotte. Her breath caught in her chest, the weight of his words sinking in. She hadn't even realized they were being followed, but the way the man's eyes darted to the rearview mirror told her everything she needed to know. Who was behind them, and how long had they been there? Before Charlotte could ask, the man floored the accelerator, the car screeching forward as it picked up speed. "Hold on," he ordered sharply. The sound of tires squealing against the asphalt filled the air, and Charlotte's stomach lurched as the car shot down the road. In the distance, headlights began to close in behind them, growing brighter with each passing second. Charlotte's heart raced as she turned her head to look, barely making out the silhouette of another vehicle gaining on them. Her thoughts spun into chaos. They were being hunted again. But why? The man didn't explain. He kept his focus on the road, his hands steady, his eyes alert as he weaved through the night, trying to outrun whatever was chasing them. Charlotte's grip tightened on her seat, every muscle in her body tensed, ready for whatever was coming next. She couldn't breathe. The fear was suffocating. The headlights behind them grew closer, and then, just as Charlotte thought the car would overtake them, the man jerked the wheel hard to the left. The tires screeched again, and Charlotte barely had time to react before the car slammed into a narrow side street, skidding sideways. Her body was thrown against the door, the sharp turn knocking the air from her lungs. The man didn't slow down. He was driving like a man possessed, eyes flicking between the road and the mirror as he tried to shake their pursuers. Charlotte's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest she thought it might explode. The car careened through the streets, the other vehicle still close behind, its headlights shining menacingly in their rearview mirror. "Why are they after us?" Charlotte finally managed to get out, her voice tight with fear. The man's jaw clenched as he shot another look at her. "Because they know you're the key," he said, his voice clipped. "And they won't stop until they have you." Charlotte's stomach dropped, her hands gripping the seat as the car skidded through another turn. She wasn't just running from some criminals anymore. She was being hunted by something much larger. And she had no idea how to fight back. The car screeched around another tight corner, the tires barely keeping traction as they tore through the dark streets. Charlotte's heart raced, her mind reeling from the man's words. The key. What did that even mean? And who was chasing them? Her eyes flicked back to the rearview mirror, where the other vehicle was still close behind, gaining ground despite the sharp turns and desperate speed. The headlights were blinding, like eyes that would never blink, always watching, always closing in. A pulse of dread shot through Charlotte. She wasn't sure if they were going to outrun this chase, or if it would end with her trapped, caught in their hands. "You need to tell me what's going on," she shouted, panic rising in her chest. The man's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, but his face remained impassive, focused. His eyes darted between the road and the mirror, calculating, always calculating. "They're not going to stop," he muttered under his breath, his voice rough, barely audible over the screeching tires. "They know what you are." Charlotte didn't have time to process his cryptic words. A thud against the side of the car made her flinch, her breath catching in her throat. She twisted her head, catching a glimpse of the vehicle behind them, its headlights almost blinding through the side mirror. It was too close. The man swerved again, this time forcing the car to skid through a narrow alleyway that was barely wide enough for the vehicle. Charlotte's body was pressed against the door as the car jerked violently, the tires scraping against the concrete walls. It felt like the world around them was closing in. And then, as if the universe had decided to add another layer of terror, the car behind them honked a loud, deafening sound that rattled Charlotte's nerves and made her spine stiffen. The man's gaze hardened. "They're playing for keeps now," he muttered, his voice dark. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from behind. Charlotte flinched as the window by her side shattered in a shower of glass, the sound deafening in the confined space of the car. She gasped, ducking instinctively, her heart hammering as she covered her face with her arms. The man cursed under his breath, shifting gears to push the car harder, faster, down the alley. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the rear of the car with a sickening thud. The tires screeched as the man fought to maintain control, the car sliding precariously toward the alley's end. "Hold on," he barked at Charlotte, his voice full of urgency. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, and she gripped the edge of her seat, her fingers trembling. The sounds of the pursuit echoed in her skull. The tires, the engine roaring, the gunshots. It was as if the world had collapsed into chaos around her. The alley began to widen ahead, and the man jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car careening toward a street that looked empty, at least for the moment. But as they shot onto the main road, another vehicle pulled up, blocking their path. It was like a trap snapping shut. Charlotte's breath caught. They were surrounded. The man's eyes flicked to the new car, his face hardening in an instant. "We need to get out of here," he muttered under his breath. Now, without another word, he slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel in the opposite direction. The tires squealed as he forced the car back the way they came, desperately trying to outmaneuver the other vehicles, now closing in on both sides. The situation was slipping out of control. The enemy was everywhere. Charlotte could feel the walls closing in on her again. She wasn't just running anymore. She was cornered. The man glanced at her, his expression now more intense than ever. "They've found us," he said quietly, "and they won't stop until they have what they want." Charlotte's stomach twisted with a sickening mixture of fear and confusion. "What do they want from me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the accelerator, the car rocketing forward with reckless speed. As they barreled down the street, Charlotte's mind spun, desperate for answers. But all she could think about now was survival. Survival from whoever was chasing them. Survival from a past that was coming for her, whether she was ready or not. And the man at her side, was he her savior? Or part of the reason they were all in danger? The air felt thick with the weight of unanswered questions, and Charlotte's thoughts scrambled in every direction. She could feel her breath coming faster, the fear nearly choking her. Where were they going? Would they make it out? Or was this the end of the line? Suddenly, the man swerved the car into an even tighter alley, tires skidding dangerously. Charlotte's chest lurched, her body pushed hard against the seatbelt as she gripped the door, fighting for some semblance of control over the panic threatening to overwhelm her. The headlights of the cars behind them loomed larger, the distance closing in. Charlotte couldn't look back anymore. She had to focus. It was the only thing keeping her from losing her mind. And just as she thought they might slip through, the car jolted violently. Something a bullet had hit the rear tire. The car veered to the side, and Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The end was closing in. Fast the car swerved wildly, its rear tire blown out by the impact. Charlotte's stomach lurched as the man wrestled with the wheel, trying to keep the car from spinning out of control. The sound of metal scraping against asphalt filled the air as the car lurched to one side, tires screaming in protest. "Hold on," the man shouted, his voice hard with panic as he fought to regain control. But it was too late. With a sickening thud, the car collided with a parked van, the jolt knocking Charlotte's head back against the seat. Pain shot through her skull, but she barely felt it. The world around her was spinning, blurry, chaotic, out of control. For a moment, everything stopped. The only sound was the labored breathing of the man beside her, and the faint hiss of air escaping from the damaged tires. Charlotte blinked rapidly, trying to focus, trying to stay conscious. Her vision swam, the edges of her sight blurring, as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She wasn't sure how much time passed before she felt the car jerk forward again, a new surge of energy. The man was already out of his seatbelt, his door flung open before Charlotte could even move. "Get out!" he ordered, his voice gruff, his face drawn in determination. Charlotte didn't question him. She scrambled for the door, fumbling with the handle. It took her a moment to get it open, but once she did, she fell out of the car, hitting the ground hard. She barely felt the impact, too focused on the urgency in the man's voice. The alley was dark, shadows stretching across the pavement as they darted away from the car. The sound of footsteps behind them, heavy, fast, told Charlotte they weren't alone. Her chest tightened as she forced herself to run, her legs like lead beneath her. She had no idea where they were going. She didn't even know if she could keep up. The man was already ahead of her, pushing forward with a determined speed. Charlotte struggled to match his pace, the panic rising in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. Behind them, the pursuing cars screeched to a halt. The headlights dimmed as the doors slammed open. Heavy boots thudded against the ground, the sound of men closing in on them, their voices low but filled with intent. Charlotte didn't dare look back. "Stay close," the man barked, not bothering to glance at her. She nodded, gritting her teeth as they sprinted through the dark streets. Every step felt like it was tearing her apart, but there was no choice but to push on. The pounding of her heart was louder than anything around her. She had to keep going. The alley twisted ahead, the narrow path barely wide enough for them both. The man turned sharply, pulling her into a doorway before Charlotte could question him. The darkness of the building swallowed them whole, the thick scent of mildew and dust filling her nose. The man closed the door behind them with a soft thud, the noise muffled but still piercing in the silence that followed. Charlotte's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she leaned against the wall, her chest tight with fear and exertion. They were safe, at least for now, but the silence in the room was thick, suffocating. The man didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, his body tense, his eyes scanning the street outside the cracked window, always alert. Charlotte stood motionless, trying to steady herself. "What now?" she asked, her voice hoarse and shaky. The man glanced at her, his face unreadable. "Now we wait," he said, his voice quieter. "They'll be looking for us. We have to stay off their radar." Her mind raced, trying to piece together everything that had happened. They were being hunted. But who were they? And why was she, the key asterisk, so important? The questions buzzed in her head, louder now, but there was no time to ask them. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button with one swift motion. The lights flickered, and then the room went completely dark. "Get ready," he murmured. "They know we're here. We have to move again." Charlotte's stomach turned at the realization that they weren't safe. Not really. They were just in another waiting game. Another round of running. She nodded, even though her mind screamed for answers, for some semblance of control. She had no idea how long they'd be able to keep this up. They were already out of options. The door to the building creaked open again, and they slipped into the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick, damp air. The city felt like a maze now, each turn more treacherous than the last. As they moved through the back streets, Charlotte couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. They weren't just running from criminals or dangerous men. They were running from something much bigger, and she had no idea how to fight back, no idea how to survive, but she had no choice now. She would have to keep running, keep fighting, keep breathing. Until she found out the truth, they moved through the city like shadows, slipping through dark alleys and narrow streets, trying to stay ahead of the pursuit. Charlotte's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Her legs ached from the constant sprinting. Her lungs burned with each labored breath. The man, always ahead, never slowing down, didn't speak as they navigated through the labyrinth of the city's underbelly. His silence was heavy, pressing down on her, a constant reminder of how little she knew and how much danger she was in. Finally, they reached a nondescript building on the edge of town. The man stopped in front of a rusted metal door and turned to her. "Stay close. Do exactly what I say," he instructed, his voice sharp. Charlotte nodded, her hands shaking as she pushed the door open. The air inside was musty and stale, a stark contrast to the cool night air they had just escaped. It was clear that no one had been here in years, but it was shelter for now. They made their way down a narrow hallway, the creak of the wooden floorboards, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. Charlotte's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. There was no telling who or what might be waiting for them in this rundown place. The man stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall and knocked twice. Charlotte's breath hitched in her chest, but she didn't question him. She had learned by now that questioning him could be more dangerous than anything else. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, another figure stood, a tall man with dark, penetrating eyes. He looked at Charlotte with a coldness that made her skin crawl. "She's the one," the man asked, his voice gravelly, his gaze never leaving Charlotte's face. The man beside her nodded. "She is." Charlotte's pulse quickened. The truth was finally starting to surface. But it wasn't the truth she had expected. The man turned to her, his expression grim. "You're not just running from them," he said. "You're running from us, too." Charlotte's heart stopped. "What?" she whispered. The man's eyes were unforgiving. "Everything you thought you knew, it's all a lie. You're not who you think you are." Her mind spun. The walls seemed to close in around her. "Who am I?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. The man didn't answer immediately. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the room. "That's a question you'll have to answer for yourself." As Charlotte stepped over the threshold, her stomach twisted with an unbearable mix of dread and anticipation. She had thought she was running for her life, but now she realized that she wasn't just running from danger. She was running from the truth. And the truth was far darker than anything she had imagined. Charlotte stepped into the room, her legs unsteady beneath her. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that made her breath catch. The dim light inside the room seemed to shift, casting strange, flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick, heavy with something she couldn't quite name. The man who had led her here, the one who had kept her alive so far, stepped in behind her, his eyes scanning the room with a cold intensity. The tall figure who had greeted them, whose eyes seemed to pierce right through her, moved closer. His presence was imposing, like something dark, something that didn't belong in a world like hers. The man beside Charlotte didn't speak. Instead, he stood silently by the door, as though waiting for something. For the first time, Charlotte noticed the tension in his shoulders, the unease in his movements. "Sit down," the man in front of her finally said, his voice low but commanding. Charlotte's mind was spinning, but her body moved before her thoughts could catch up. She lowered herself into a worn, old chair near the far corner of the room, the creaking sound echoing in the stillness. The tall man took a seat across from her, his gaze never leaving her face. "We've been watching you," he said, his tone unyielding. "Everything you thought you knew about yourself. It's all wrong." Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest. The truth, what truth? She was desperate for answers, but the weight of fear and confusion tangled in her mind, making it impossible to focus. The man's eyes narrowed. "You're more than just a pawn in a game," he continued. "You're the key to something much bigger. Something dangerous." Her throat went dry. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your father wasn't just a criminal. He was involved in something far darker. And you've inherited more than just his blood." Charlotte recoiled, the words hitting her like a slap to the face. Her father. The very man she had once thought she could escape from. But now it all made sense. The chase, the secrecy, the constant threat. She wasn't just a victim. She was a part of it. She stood up abruptly, her legs trembling. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, this can't be true." The man's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "but it is. And now you have a choice to make. The truth is out there, and you're going to have to decide who you really are." Charlotte took a shaky breath, her world spinning faster and faster, the weight of the revelation crashing over her. She had spent so long running from the past, from her father's shadow. But now, she realized that the past wasn't something she could escape. The truth had found her, and there was no running anymore. With the room silent around her, Charlotte took her first steady breath in what felt like years. She hadn't yet found the strength to face what was coming. But one thing was certain. She was no longer the person she used to be, and the battle for who she would become, who she truly was, had only just begun.